Councillor South End Branchman Thompson. Motion 47. Comrades, this motion rests on strong foundations. Internationally, views in childhood and the relations between adults and children have undergone a revolution. These important and profound changes have only recently reached Scotland. They are challenging traditional Scottish ideas on parenting and children's rights. The UK is currently in breach of its human rights obligations to children under Article 17 of the European Social Charter, as well as being in breach of Article 19 of the Convention on the Rights of Children, of the Rights of the Child. We in Scotland are in breach right now of our human rights obligations towards children, as we are on a range of other human rights issues. Internationally, a tried and tested method has developed over the years that reduces violence against children. This method rests on two pillars: legal prohibition of violence towards children by anyone, including parents, and the second pillar, increased support for families and parenting, channeled through public and civil society agencies, combined with public education programmes on positive parenting. Though familiar and well understood, these ideas are relatively new to Scotland. In passing this resolution, the SSP will be joining and supporting a movement that is international in scope. That corporal punishment harms children is not in doubt, though this does challenge traditional Scottish attitudes. This debate is gaining an increasing, albeit delayed, prominence in Scotland. In May 2003, the ban was included as part of the Criminal Justice Scotland Bill. It was eventually dropped. In May 2005, MSP Marlon Glenn's amendment to the Family Law Scotland Bill prohibiting physical punishment gained considerable press coverage, but it too was dropped following opposition from Justice 2 Committee. The Scottish political establishment are well aware that they will have to implement this ban sooner or later. They are delaying, waiting for a more opportune time that minimises their political risk. Some comrades are concerned these measures criminalise parents, especially working class parents. These well-meaning concerns are unfounded. The tried and tested international model works on the principle that adults are not prosecuted for trivial assaults on other adults, and hence parents are not prosecuted for trivial smacks. This is well understood. Parents are not criminalised. This is the same in all the other countries where this ban has already been introduced. Finally, consider a statement by the 4 UK Commissioners for Children and Young People, released on the 22nd of January 2005. And I quote, "This long overdue reform for children is becoming inevitable, and we urge the Government and the Scottish Executive to promote consistent legislation throughout the UK to give all children full protection under the law on assault." And they continue, "It can count on our vocal support and also that of the strongest and broadest alliance of professional and other organisations ever formed around an issue for children." Comrades, I urge you to support this resolution and to join this broad alliance. Thank you.
Neil Scott, Mary Hill North. Comrades, this issue it's about equality. Children up to 3 are offered protection under the law from physical harm, as are adults. But there's a section of our community who aren't offered the same protection as everyone else. The law at the moment permits physical punishment to be meted out to most children and young adults. As a teacher, I have to think, what does this teach our children? And in my opinion, this teaches our children that in our capitalist, patriarchal society, it teaches them that violence can be a solution to problems. Criminalisation, people talk about criminalisation. I don't believe it's about criminalising anyone. And our motion, I think, states quite clearly that it's a motion about education. In other countries, as Steve said, that have placed their children's mental and physical well-being as a priority in their legislation, their experience has shown that the effect has been to make physical chastisement unacceptable. Their ban, like the ban we proposed, stresses that it's an educational thing rather than a punitive thing. So that, to me, that makes Amendment B a little while unnecessary. The experience in Sweden shows that pre-1979, 53% of Swedes were supportive of corporal punishment. Only 11% nowadays are support its use, and most of that 11% are from the same demographic that last year when this was tried to introduce into the Scottish Parliament, it's from the same demographic that were against it, and that demographic was the religious right. The religious right who say that it says in the Bible that they are allowed to use an instrument to physically punish their children. A recent survey in Scotland showed that working class families are less likely than middle class families to mete out physical punishment to children. And as a teacher, another thing, problem solving thing. I've talked to primary 7s, and one of the things that I talk about with primary 7s is say, look, if you're walking down the street, you're eating a sweet, someone whacks you in the back of the head and says, don't eat that sweet, you should be eating your dinner, or you're going to get your dinner in a little while. Does that teach you why you should not be eating a sweet, or does it make, what does it make you do? And most children have said to me that it doesn't actually make them think about the problem that they are supposed to be thinking about. It actually makes them more angry. It does not help problem solving skills. So I would like to know what smacking is supposed to help. Thank you, comrades.
Comrades, we had a good discussion about this motion at the Borders branch, and I have to say it was kind of a reluctance that we felt we needed to put an amendment forward. And I say reluctance there because this isn't an amendment about saying it's alright to hit kids. I hope nobody thinks that I'm going to stand here and say, oh, I go back and do it a few times and it never done me any harm. This is about accepting that it is wrong to physically punish children. We accept the first part saying that research clearly shows that corporal punishment is ineffective. We would accept that. We decided to amend the parts of the motion, however, that seek to change the law. And as I say, it doesn't mean that we disagree with large parts of the motion, it doesn't mean that we're the Christian right in America or anything like that. I have 4 young children myself, and myself and my wife don't smack our children. However, we're concerned that whilst we should campaign and we should argue for parents not to smack their children, we think we should stop short of criminalising them, and I have to say I think that is what the motion does. And the example I'll give you, comrades, is a comrade in the Borders branch who has only once smacked her daughter, and that was because when her daughter was 8 she ran out between 2 parked cars into the road, and she just, as a reaction, smacked her daughter. Now, would we say that comrade should be prosecuted for assault against the child? I don't think we should be doing that. Even if this was passed, it doesn't stop what is really important, that's the systematic abuse of children. The people who are harming kids, who are hitting their children, aren't they going to stop doing that because of the law changing? So I think let's educate parents, let's support parents, let's help parents, but please don't criminalise them, comrades. Thank you.
Both people of Lothian Branch and the RCN speaking for the motion and against the Borders Central Amendment. My father was a socialist and a trade unionist, and he worked in the steelworks, and he moved big pieces of metal for a living. But when he came home sometimes, he used to move my head about as well with his hands. You know, I was beaten by my father quite regularly, right? But that wasn't because he was a bad person particularly. He had a lot of good values, but he didn't actually know that it was wrong, right? And I think sometimes we need to send out a very, very clear message that certain things are wrong, like drunk driving, like beating up your partner, things like that. We wouldn't argue that those are good laws, and I think we do need legislation that protects children, right? Because children are vulnerable, right, and they have few rights in our society. And I think the amendment actually weakens the message. So I would ask you to vote against the amendment and vote for the motion.
Liz Walker's response. I joined this party because, first of all, it stands up for working class people. And it also stands up for women. And I feel with this motion that despite what the mover of the motion has said, that it does criminalise and stigmatise not only people in general, but especially women, and I think that's totally against everything that this party stands for. It doesn't actually state, although the mover said that this will not criminalise people, that a smack is okay in other countries. I don't know how you judge that. But it doesn't actually say in the motion that people will not be criminalised by this or stigmatised. I think they certainly will be stigmatised, but it doesn't actually say that they won't be criminalised. And I think it should be, before anyone should think of even voting for this, it should be absolutely clear what constitutes criminalisation in this. I think we should vote for the amendment because it gives us a chance to approach this subject more in a way of persuasion rather than criminalisation. Education is incredibly important in this, and I was a parent myself. I'm a parent myself. I brought up young children. It can be incredibly frustrating sometimes. It can be frustrating for anyone, but it's especially frustrating if you're poor and you don't have money to take your children out and you're stuck inside with them all day. And we need education not when people already have the children. We need education for children in schools, and there are lots of schemes available where children get to look after a baby and get to realise just what it's like to be with a child and constantly demanding. And I think we should support the amendment, the borders, so that we don't put off people who would genuinely want to join this party for the very good reasons that we do stand up for the working class and stand up for women. I think if we agreed to this, we'd be a laughing stock, and it would put people off joining the party because they immediately see themselves as being stigmatised. Thank you.
Katrina Grant from Edinburgh Central, speaking against the Borders Amendment. I think I understand where the Borders are coming from. However, I think actually it should be against the law to physically chastise children. I think you're not allowed to assault anybody, and you're not allowed to consent to being assaulted either in Scotland. And I don't understand why we have a law for adults and grown-ups, but children actually still can be hit. And you see children being hit all the time in supermarkets and on the bus and at bus stops, and it's sometimes very hard and difficult in how you intervene. But on domestic abuse, we would never ever take the position all you've got to do is educate. We would actually argue, we have argued, that as there's no excuse for domestic abuse, and I think there's no excuse for child abuse either. Physically chastising your child is physical abuse. There's no getting away from it. But let's be clear what we're talking about. I think it should be against the law, and in certain cases, yes, you should be criminalised. However, there's certain ways that that can be done. And I think sometimes, I know some of the discussion yesterday, people talk about the criminal justice system, and I actually think maybe most people don't understand how the criminal justice system works. In Edinburgh, for example, and probably most councils in Scotland have a diversion from prosecution service. In Edinburgh, the majority of the work there is actually working with parents who have physically chastised the children or neglected their children. And if they agree to work with social work and to change some of the behaviour, employ parenting classes and make sure the children are looked after and they can change their parenting behaviour, then the procurator fiscal drops all charges. It doesn't go on the record or anything like that. And Sutton Probation Service down in London and also in Canada, they've developed what's called the Caring Dads programme, and for men who have actually abused their children and who go through that, and if they go through that successfully, then all charges are dropped, but they're still held within the criminal justice system. I think we should have parenting and education and support for working class people who find it very difficult when parenting becomes overwhelming for them. However, maybe sometimes some husbands and boyfriends think it's overwhelming to have a wife or a girlfriend that nags them, but still we actually say that is domestic abuse. There's no excuse, and so I have to ask comrades to not support the border essential, but to support the composite motion with the amendment. But let's discuss this properly in the party. Let's really discuss this. Remember those in this room who were ever hit as a parent, or when you were ever smacked by the teacher or belted. I used to get belted all the time for talking too much in class. And all it ever was about was humiliation, and it didn't work.
I find myself agreeing with what people in Katrina have just said. You know, it's not about saying that it is alright to hit kids. We accept that. It is wrong, it's bad, and we should be encouraging parents not to do it. But I've got to ask, is it beneficial for children whose parents are only abusive, who they're only bad, but they've smacked their kid in a moment when they're highly stressed, when they're tired or something? Is it beneficial for that child, for their parents to go through the criminal justice system at any stage? I don't think it is. I don't think we should be advocating that. So let's plough resources into education. Let's engage with parents about no smacking their kids. Let's be unequivocal about that. We're not for smacking kids, but let's not criminalise them either.
Comrades, as Steve was saying earlier on, there's 15 countries in the world, in Europe, have already passed legislation that is the equivalent to our motion. And I can't go through all of the countries, but what I've done, I've looked at one of the countries. All of the other countries have published information about what has gone on in their countries since they've introduced the legislation. But one of the countries was Sweden, and it introduced the legislation back in 1979. Now, I'll go through what I've written here. It's all about criminalisation. The proportion of suspects prosecuted for child abuse in Sweden who are in their 20s and therefore raised in a no-smacking culture has decreased significantly. Violence against children has decreased since violence has been made unacceptable in law. The prosecution rate has shown a declining trend. There's been no increase of parents being drawn into the criminal justice system since the introduction in 1979. There's been no increase of children being removed from parents through intervention. Quite the reverse, actually. The number of children coming into care has decreased by 26% since 1982. And increasingly, those have been short-term placements. Youth crime has remained steady since the introduction of the no-smack culture. Children involved in theft, narcotics crime, drug and alcoholic intake has declined. Young people's suicide rate has declined. Assault against children by children has decreased. Perhaps it is oversimplified to say that the ban has had a direct causal effect, but it's certainly not had a negative effect. In modifying public attitudes, it has an overwhelmingly positive effect. Support the motion and drop the amendment.
Not even second time. It's just that I feel that the actual motion doesn't quite go far enough. I've been a foster parent for about 30 odd years, and in that time I've obviously experienced and come across quite horrendous instances of abuse of various forms. But I think probably the worst case involved a child that was about 10 or 11, and he was never physically abused by his parent. His parent didn't believe in chastising the child, in fairness, but she treated him almost like a peer, like an equal of some sort. And what she ended up doing was actually the verbal stuff. The constantly putting him down, the constant abuse in that fashion. And over a period of time, this had a very, very deep psychological impact on that kid, to such an extent that nobody could cope with him anymore. It took many, many years of subsequently treatment and stuff like that to actually get him back on the track, to make him feel it wasn't all his fault. So abuse, or a smack or whatever, to me doesn't really cover the extent and some of the stuff that goes on. Because we have to be careful with this type of education we're talking about. If we're talking about not using corporal punishment, but using some form of, talking sort of business, we'd be very, very careful as to how we go about that. And I think education, goes a long way, but there's a lot more to this thing than actually this abuse of this physical thing. I don't think this motion actually covers, to the same extent, the same type of severe physical or mental abuse that causes much more prolonged damage. Thank you.
Losses and legal branch. I wasn't actually expecting to be summing up for this motion, but I do support it wholeheartedly, so I'm quite happy to do so if that's all right with the movers. I'm happy that the amendment from Borders was not passed, although I understand where they're coming from. I'm a parent myself, as most of you know. I have two children, one's 21, he was actually here yesterday, and the other one is 17. And when the 21-year-old was probably about 3 years old, I did hit him once, and I've regretted it for the rest of my life, and I never hit my other son. I was smacked myself often by my father, actually, when I think about it, not my mother, strangely enough, but and it didn't damage me, but looking back on it, I can't see any sensible reason for having done it. And really why I want you to support this motion is that I cannot understand why Britain should not sign up to this legislation when 16 other European countries do it. To me, that's a sign that it's progressive legislation. It's a bit like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have signed up to it, but we don't actually stick to it. But we should sign up to this, and I think that the education won't happen unless this is made into legislation. I don't believe that we would have heart-eating campaigns like zero tolerance against violence against women if it wasn't accepted by the tops of society that we have to actually do something against it. And also I think if we don't call for legal protection for children, that means that in reality we don't accept that they have the same rights to protection as adults. And how bad is that? That can't be right. I don't believe that legislation would end up in criminalising parents, but I do believe that it would lay the foundation for a serious and properly resourced campaign of public education to parents to explain to them why the punishment of their children, physical or verbal, the previous speaker is quite right, it's not just physical abuse, but we have to tackle that first. And I think what we as socialists obviously understand is that the frustration, the stress that many parents have to cope with, low incomes, no jobs, no prospects for their children, addiction, drugs, alcohol, all the rest of it, these are symptoms of a capitalist society which is deeply unequal. And we as socialists are trying to address that. and I think it only makes sense that we incorporate legislation into our programme so that this investment and the resources are directing those in that direction. So I'll urge you to support the motion. Thanks.
Now move to the vote on motion 47. Those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? The motion is carried. Comrades, before we move on to the next motion,